The long overdue suspension video is finally here. First off, sorry it has taken me so long to make this. I can give you a million reasons why, but really what you need to know is I built this truck, which I own, it's my personal truck, but I built it basically for four-wheeler magazine. And what I realized very early on is if I started filming it, I was going to be way ahead of how the magazine was going to come out, and that was going to be a big problem. So I initially made the first video on this thing, which was all about building the axles, and went through that, and then nothing happened for a long time. And that was mostly because I needed to make sure that four-wheeler basically had the exclusive to it. I built this truck with low range 4x4 here in Wilmington. You'll hear me say I'll go back and forth. This was definitely not a one-man show. Kelly Carter, Nick Sarabonich, Josh Whitcomb, Jeff Nelson, all guys that participated in making this thing become a reality. I really appreciate all the help. It takes a long time to do something like this, especially when I'm either over your shoulder filming or I'm very slow and I'm doing it in addition to them. So it's taken a little while, but we're here now. This video is going to be all about the suspension and kind of break down why I went with the suspension that I did. I'll go over coilover rates. I've changed a lot of this stuff. I've changed the ride height of the truck. It's one of the reasons that I just kept waiting. This truck's been driving for a couple years now, and I've taken it to Uwharrie and the beach and the farm and just had a lot of fun with it. My kids love it. They call it Darrington, which if you're a dad and you watch Blaze and the Monster Machines, you'll understand that little monster truck reference. But a lot of fun, love this thing. So I've got some notes today because there's just so many numbers that my old man brain's not going to work for it. And if I look like I'm moving around a little funny, my shoulder is currently fractured here and torn here from riding motorcycles. So hence why I actually finally had some time to sit down and do this. So let's get into, I guess, where we left off last time, which was the axles were built, and then we had to start breaking down the suspension underneath this thing. Obviously the truck was originally IFS. Primarily we used sawzalls and grinders to cut and unbolt all of the original suspension that was underneath of it. The truck had a little bit of rust in the back, so that was a little bit of pain. We had to cut bolts off and whatnot for the leaf springs, but once we got all that out, one of the big goals for this truck from the very beginning is I really didn't want it super tall. The S10 wheel wells are very narrow. So one of the first things we did is I already knew I was going to run these 40-inch mud grapplers. So we got the truck on the lift, and once all the IFS stuff was cut out, we tucked the 60 up front and the 14 bolt out back, and just kept lowering the truck as much as we could until the tire would hit, and then we'd trim out some more fender, then lower it a little bit more, and then we finally got to a point where, okay, this is as much up travel as this differential is going to allow us in the front. We still have plenty of room in the back, but we said, okay, this is as stuffed as I can get. If I'd pushed the front end forward and gone maybe like full hydraulic steering, I could have chopped up this and actually made it a little bit lower, but I really wanted to preserve how the truck looked up front. That was important as well to me. I just thought I liked how, you know, it was recognizable as an S10, wanted to keep the grill. So we were definitely limited. I knew I was going to have to cut into very close to the firewall, and it was going to be tight, but given this thing is a high pinion Dana 60 Ford Super Duty, so your 99-04 axle, and I knew I was going to go with like a 3.5-inch back spaced wheel. It was going to be really wide, so that was going to help keep a lot of the tire out of the wheel well. Originally, when I pulled the truck into low range, I actually got it on their like 4-post lift, their alignment rack, and had started making some rough measurements on, okay, I think the links, I knew I wanted to go link suspension, so I was kind of getting an idea of how long the links would need to be, where they would attach to, and then went home with those numbers and started doing some research on long arm kits and seeing what long arm kits out there existed that would make sense. And I ended up with a Jeep Wrangler LJ long arm kit from a company called Rock Crawler. I'd had their suspension in the past. I kind of had an idea. I knew their links were super heavy and solid, so I wasn't worried about this. And I knew they made a lot of 3 links for the front, which I had a feeling was going to be important just for packaging. For the shocks, I had done some sort of preliminary weight of the vehicle, had an idea. It was around 5,000 pounds. It was very close to JK weight. And I knew there were 1,000,001 shocks for JKs. I originally considered doing coils for the truck and just doing a coil and shock combo, and then I realized that packaging was going to be a little interesting, and it was going to be a lot more work to try to get the spring rate right. And so I decided to go a little bit more expensive and get an emulsion coilover, which was still like the cheapest coilover I could get. And Rock Crawler had JK coilovers that were 12-inch travel that were designed for JK weight. And for me, that was more than enough in my mind to support the S10, and I could go ahead and get a coil that already had a spring rate that was going to be pretty close, and a travel link that was fine for my needs. I never intended this thing to be like a go fast off-roader. I'm based out of southeastern North Carolina, so it's just going to crawl slowly over rocks basically, and take my kids to the beach. I just wanted a cool solid axle truck. That's really what it shook out to. The high pinion 60 up front, I needed to do a little bit of work on the cast side of the differential, so your driver's side of the differential, to make room for suspension brackets. Now, the suspension brackets on the axle, I'm using Artec Super Duty specific lowers, and then at the upper, I have the Rock Crawler 3-link upper that comes with the TJ kit. So that's how it's set up at the axle. I ended up having the coilover mounts built by my local Area 51 fabricating facility that they do powder coating and all that stuff. Had an idea of where I wanted them. I knew I wanted the coilover swept, so that's the lower mount setup. On the frame side, I picked up a set of Barnes 4-wheel drive lower control arm mounts, which we just welded directly to the bottom of the frame, and then used kind of a custom upper control arm bracket that would go on the inside of the frame that we reinforced, and that was a little tricky. One of the challenges there is Rock Crawler uses metric bolts, so I had to get this really expensive custom metric bolt that would be long enough that could go to that upper. Just one of those kind of weird things, but that's kind of how it all fell out. Now, where the links actually bolted up was because of where I wanted the axle. That's kind of how everything landed, and I kind of got lucky, honestly, with how it is. Now, for you guys that are looking for numbers, I actually do have the control arm length number. So as it sits right now, my lowers are at 40.5 inches. That's from the center of the bolt to the center of the bolt, and it's a 3-link, so single upper on the passenger side, and it is 44.5 inches from center bolt to center bolt. And with that, the arms are not at any type of high angle or anything, and I can tell you, after driving the truck for a couple of years, it drives great. Not a lot of weirdness. You do get some kind of axle twist because it is a 3-link. I like 4 links better for safety. I like 3 links better for flex. Packaging, it just was going to be a lot easier. It's just really tight with that differential on the driver's side to try to package another control arm, especially with the transfer case and drive shaft being there. So decided just to stick with the 3 links. We knew we didn't have a ton of room in the front wheel wells to mount a giant coilover. Now, what we ended up using, it's 1.5 120 wall DOM tubing that was bent to make custom hoops. Now, this was all reinforced, and we've got 1/4 inch plate brackets that has reinforcements everywhere it touches the frame, and I haven't had a single issue. I've had it for a long time like this, and we swept everything back. The shock currently sits at about 18 degrees on each side. This is just in the front. I knew if I swept it back, I could get some more travel out of it, so I could take a 12-inch shock and get about 14 inches of travel out of it. It would package a little bit better, and so that's what I've done. Now, as it sits today, I'm currently using 225 over a 300. I could have made it lighter, both top and bottom. And if I had a sway bar on this thing, which I do not, I'd probably go that route. Without having a sway bar, I like this. I've got about 3.5 inches of up travel as it sits, maybe a touch more. Right now I have it set up where I've got about 1 inch until the primary collapses. Basically, I got a primary stop, and then I go into that secondary 300, and I've got 1 inch of preload on it. So that's how the front end's set up. It's not super bouncy, works well. Again, I knew I wasn't going to be able to get a ton of up travel and still be able to keep this thing really low. It is still valved how Rock Crawler valved it for a JK, which, as in my opinion, is fine. It works and rides fine. I don't have an issue with it blowing through or anything like that. So I feel like the compression valving is fine. The rebound valving feels fine. It doesn't unload super quick. It's pretty good. Again, I could go with a lighter rate and stick with that same valving, but driving on the street without a sway bar and going lighter, I just feel like it's going to be a little bit too all over the place. So I decided not to do that. Track bar configuration on it, we played with a good bit. Again, we were trying to get the track bar up as high as we could to keep a good roll center for the truck, but I needed up travel, so that was kind of a hard balance. I did have sort of an initial game plan, if you've seen the magazine, how I did it. It worked okay, but it had a little bit of bump steer. So what we ended up doing is moving the track bar bracket at the axle side forward, which actually brought it down about 1.5 inches, which was really where it needed to be with the pitman arm. So those things would both cycle at the same point and not have an issue of weird bump steers. Out back at the axle side, I ended up doing super high clearance, lower control arm mounts from Barnes 4-wheel drive. Barnes mounts also on the frame side for the lowers and the frame side for the uppers. The rear is the Rock Crawler 4-link truss. So that's just how they send it, welded on, not really complicated for that. Again, I've got a 14-bolt rear. They make those trusses for different axles, so you can tell them, hey, I've got 3.5-inch tubes or 3-inch tubes, whatever you have. So welded that up. Same deal. We already knew where we wanted the axle based off of our trimming and sort of the center of the wheel well. And got the links burnt in. That wasn't super complicated. Again, it was 4-link with a lot of the, stuff already kind of figured out. We did, having the lowers tucked out on the outside of the frame rail, the concept there was just so I don't hit them as much, try to keep them tucked up as high as I could. I know that goofs up with the geometry a little bit, but it was worth it, especially for this thing. In terms of the coilover, okay, so unlike up front where it's swept, in the back it's straight up and down. I knew that was going to make it easier to figure out rates. I had an idea that there was going to be some fluctuation in what I was going to carry with this thing. Still wasn't sure how I was going to do the spare and all that stuff at the time. So we mocked up some weight, put the spare in the back, kind of figured out how much fuel it was going to be in the back, and then built accordingly. And now it's that same JK front Rock Crawler coilover and same valving that they put in their coilovers for JKs, and that's been a little aggressive for as light as the truck is in the back. And to combat that, I sort of started playing with spring rates. So in the back, I'm much lighter. I have a 150 over a 225. So that's my spring rate setup, and I've got it where I only have about 1/2 inch of preload with that setup. and 1.5 inches of primary until it goes to the second. Okay, in terms of rear arm numbers, if you're curious about that, the lowers are set right now at 44 inches from center of the bolt. The uppers are right at 48 inches. So I've got good arm separation, good similarity. The points all seem to be good. The rear suspension doesn't do anything wonky. I don't get a lot of axle turn or anything like that. So that seems to work fairly well for my needs. One thing that I did figure out, and I'll talk a little bit more about when I do the Atlas video, is we wanted a lot of travel out of this thing, and one thing we really were not anticipating is how short the front drive shaft was going to be. And what ended up happening is, even though I ended up having to clock the Atlas as much as I could to get more travel out of that front drive shaft, I'm running a 1350 CV, I still had to limit strap the axle on the driver's side. So added limit strap setup, and it's funny, you get a little bit more travel out of that side, but I got to keep the U-joints alive, and that was our sort of best way to do that. That's it. If you stayed around to the end of this video, thanks. If you hopefully you found it informative, and we'll be doing some more S10 stuff and wheeling pretty soon. So just got to heal up, and I'll be back dirt biking and S10ing in hopefully 4 to 6 weeks. So we'll see. All right, guys, take care. Bye-bye.